The first time Cora Bancroft saw Albert Garrett again, he was hauling lumber through the center of Wren's Crossing in a wagon so heavy it groaned on its axles, and half the town had already picked up rifles before he'd said a single word. That was the spring of 1886, and the dust on the road still remembered the sound of gunfire from nearly 20 years before, when the man now sitting stiff and gray-bearded on that wagon seat had ridden through with 6 other men and left her father bleeding out on the steps of the Mercantile. She had been 19 then. She was 38 now, unmarried, the schoolteacher for the town's 23 children, and she had spent 2 decades believing that if she ever saw Albert Garrett's face again, she would want to put a bullet through it. Instead, she stood on the porch of the schoolhouse with her hand pressed flat against her chest, and she found she could not move at all. "That's him," said old Mrs. Petrie beside her, gripping the porch rail so hard her knuckles went white. "Lord above, that is him. I'd know that scar on his jaw anywhere." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, and Albert Garrett climbed down slow, the way a man climbs down when his knees have seen too many winters and too many horses. He was tall still, though stooped some, with a gray mustache and eyes the color of a November sky. He wore no gun belt. That was the first thing Sheriff Roy Tate noticed when he stepped out onto the boardwalk with his hand already resting on his own revolver. "Garrett," the sheriff said, and the word came out like a curse. "Sheriff." Albert Garrett took off his hat. His hands, Cora noticed even from that distance, trembled slightly, though whether from age or nerves she could not tell. "I've come to build a school." For a moment nobody in Wren's Crossing said anything at all. A hawk cried somewhere over the ridge to the east. A dog barked twice and fell silent. Then Roy Tate laughed, a short bitter bark of a laugh, and half the men gathered near the feed store laughed with him, though there was no joy in any of it. "You've come to build a school," Roy Tate repeated. "You rode with Dutch Malone. You robbed the cattleman's bank not 80 feet from where you're standing. You put 2 bullets in Ezra Bancroft and left him to die on those very steps. And now you tell me you've come to build a school." Cora's breath caught at the sound of her father's name spoken aloud in that dusty street, and something old and raw twisted in her chest. Albert Garrett did not flinch from the accusation. He simply nodded slow, as though he had expected exactly this, and had already made peace with hearing it 100 times over in 100 towns before this one. "I did all that," he said. "I won't stand here and tell you different, or beg forgiveness I ain't earned. I've got lumber in that wagon and money in the bank at Cheyenne to pay for the rest, and I mean to build a schoolhouse for the children of this town, whether you let me stay to see it built or run me out the moment the last nail's driven. That's all I've come to say. Run you out." Roy Tate's hand had not left his revolver. "Mister, there's men in this town who'd string you up before supper and sleep easy after." "Then let them," Albert Garrett said quietly, and there was something in his voice, some deep and terrible tiredness that made even Roy Tate go still. "I've buried enough men who did less harm than I did and lived to old age anyway. I ain't afraid of a rope, Sheriff. I'm afraid of dying without doing one thing in this world that weighs against everything I took from it." Cora Bancroft found herself walking down the porch steps before she had decided to move at all. The schoolchildren behind her had crowded to the windows, small faces pressed to the glass, and she was aware of Mrs. Petrie's hand reaching for her sleeve and missing. She stopped 10 feet from him. Up close, the years showed plainer on his face, deep lines around eyes that would not meet hers directly, a weariness that went bone deep. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent a long time trying to outrun something that had finally caught him. "You remember me," she said. It was not a question. Albert Garrett's jaw tightened. "Miss Bancroft," he said, and the fact that he knew her name still after all these years sent a cold shiver down her spine. "I remember every face I ever wronged. I've carried yours a long time. You killed my father." "I did." He did not look away this time, though it seemed to cost him something to hold her gaze. "I was 22 years old and I'd been riding with Dutch Malone since the war ended, and I told myself it was on account of the war, on account of what the war had done to all of us, but that's a coward's excuse and I know it now. Your father tried to stop us taking the bank's strongbox and I shot him for it, and I have thought of his face more nights than I have not, ma'am, in 20 years. The town square had gone entirely silent. Even the flies seemed to have stopped their buzzing. Cora felt her hands shaking at her sides and pressed them flat against her skirts to still them. "And you think a schoolhouse buys that back?" she said. "No, ma'am. I don't think anything buys that back. But I mean to spend what's left of my life trying anyhow, because the alternative is to spend it doing nothing at all, and I find I cannot stomach that anymore." Roy Tate stepped down off the boardwalk then, putting himself between them, though Cora had not asked for protecting. "You've got till sundown to be off this street," the sheriff said. "Lumber and all. I won't have you in this town another hour longer than it takes to load that wagon back up." But Cora Bancroft, to her own great surprise, found herself lifting a hand. "Wait," she said. Every eye in the street turned to her. "Cora," Mrs. Petrie called from the porch, alarm plain in her voice. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" "I don't know," Cora admitted, and it was the truth. She looked at Albert Garrett, this man whose name had haunted her family's supper table for 2 decades, whose crime had left her mother a widow and her a girl who grew up too fast, and she felt something she could not name pulling at her, some thread of curiosity or grief or plain stubbornness that would not let this end so simply. "This town's children have been learning their letters in a church basement for 6 years because there's never been money enough to build them a proper school," she said, her voice steadier now than she felt. "If this man means what he says, if he truly means to build it and not just talk of building it, then perhaps the town ought to see whether his hands are worth trusting before it puts a rope around his neck." "Cora Bancroft," Roy Tate said, incredulous, "have you gone simple? This is the man who—" "I know exactly what he is, Sheriff. I have known it longer than you have lived in this town." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. "But I would rather see justice done through the sweat of his own back than through a rope that lets him escape easy into whatever comes after. Let him build. If he fails or if he runs, then you may do as you please with him, but let him build first." Albert Garrett looked at her then with an expression she could not read at all, something between disbelief and a grief so old it had turned to something almost gentle. "Thank you, Miss Bancroft," he said quietly. "I don't deserve the chance. But I'll not waste it." Roy Tate spat in the dust and turned away, muttering that he would be watching, that the first wrong move would be the last one Albert Garrett ever made in Wren's Crossing. The crowd began to disperse, some grumbling, some simply staring, and Cora Bancroft stood in the street with her heart pounding and wondered what exactly she had just done. That night, Albert Garrett slept in the loft of the livery stable, having paid the owner, a taciturn man named Hollis Reed, 3 months' rent in advance for the privilege. Cora lay awake in her own small house at the edge of town, staring at the ceiling, hearing her father's name in that stranger's mouth over and over, and finding that the anger she had expected to feel was tangled up now with something far more complicated. She thought of her father, Ezra Bancroft, a quiet man who had run the mercantile and taught her to read from an old dog-eared Bible before she was old enough to hold a pencil steady. She thought of her mother, who had died 8 years later of a fever that the town's doctor said was made worse by a heart that had simply given up trying. She thought of all the years since, the small satisfactions of teaching other people's children their letters, the quiet loneliness of a house built for a family that had never come to fill it. And she thought of Albert Garrett's face in the dust-choked street, the way his hands had trembled, the depth of exhaustion in his voice when he spoke of carrying her face all these years. She did not forgive him. She told herself firmly, staring at the dark ceiling, that she did not forgive him and never would. But she found, uneasily, that she wanted to see what he would do next. He began work before dawn the next morning. Cora woke to the sound of hammering, sharp and rhythmic, carrying across the still morning air, and when she dressed and walked toward the empty lot behind the church where the town had long talked of building a proper school and never had, she found Albert Garrett already stripped to his shirt sleeves, marking out the foundation lines with stakes and twine, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. He looked up when he heard her approach and straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back. "Miss Bancroft," he said, touching his hat brim, "you're up early. Man my age can't afford to waste daylight." He looked at the lot around them, the tall grass he'd already begun clearing, the stakes marking a rectangle far larger than the church basement they'd been making do with. "I mean to build it big enough for 40 children, with a room besides for whoever teaches them, so nobody's crowded onto benches meant for half that number." 40, Cora repeated. "There's not 40 children in this whole county." "There will be," Albert Garrett said, "if the railroad keeps bringing families the way it has these last years. Better to build for what's coming than what's already here, my mother used to say, though I confess I didn't listen to much else she told me." Something in the way he said it, some rough edge of old grief, made Cora look at him more closely. "Your mother's passed. When I was 11, consumption. My father had already run off some years before that, so it was an aunt raised me after, out in the Missouri Hill country, and not gently." He shook his head as though shaking off the memory. "I don't say that to earn your pity, Miss Bancroft. Plenty of men had harder starts and turned out better than I did. I say it only so you understand I ain't offering excuses. Just explaining how a boy comes to ride with men like Dutch Malone in the first place, if you care to know." "I don't know that I do," Cora said, though even as she said it she felt the lie of it settle uneasily in her chest. Albert Garrett nodded, accepting this, and bent back to his work. Cora watched him a moment longer, the careful, unhurried way he set each stake, the small grunts of effort as he swung the mallet, and then she turned and walked on toward the schoolhouse, telling herself she had only stopped to see for herself whether he'd truly begun. Over the following weeks, the frame of the new schoolhouse began to rise from the prairie lot, board by board, and the town watched with a wary, uneasy fascination. Albert Garrett worked from before sunrise until the light failed each evening, hiring no help beyond what old Holly's Reed's grandson could spare after his own chores, paying the boy fairly and teaching him, along the way, how to true a joint and set a window frame square. He ate alone at the boarding house, spoke to almost no one beyond what business required, and each Sunday he sat in the very back pew of the little clapboard church, though several families made quite a show of moving their seats when he came in. Cora found herself walking past the lot most afternoons on her way home from the schoolhouse, telling herself each time that it was simple curiosity, nothing more, and each time lingering a little longer than the walk required. It was on one such afternoon, nearly a month into the work, that she found him sitting on an overturned crate at the end of the day, his shirt soaked through, staring at the half-raised frame with an expression of such profound and quiet sorrow that she stopped without meaning to. "Mr. Garrett," he looked up startled and quickly smoothed his face into something more composed. "Miss Bancroft, didn't hear you come up. You looked as though you were somewhere far away." "I was thinking of a town called Coyote Bend," he said after a moment, as though deciding something. "Down in the Nations, near the Arkansas line. Dutch Malone and I robbed the bank there in the spring of '68. There was a boy, maybe 9 years old, ran out into the street when the shooting started, trying to reach his father who was working the livery across the way. One of Dutch's men, a fellow called Silas Crane, near shot that boy down by accident, firing wild at the marshal. Missed him by inches. I remember the mother's scream better than I remember most anything from those years." He shook his head slowly. "I built the third schoolhouse I ever raised in that same town 3 years back. Named it for no one, just called it the Coyote Bend School, same as anybody would. But I think of that boy every time I pass it." "The third," Cora said, startled. "How many have you built?" "This will be the 8th. He said it plainly, without pride, as a man states a simple fact. 8 towns Dutch Malone's gang rode through between 65 and 71, robbing banks in stages, and once, God forgive me, a train carrying a payroll meant for the Union soldiers still garrisoned out west. 8 towns where I did harm I can never undo. I mean to build a school in every one of them before I'm through if my health and my money hold out. And if they don't, then I reckon I'll have done what I could, and that'll have to be enough, though I don't imagine it ever truly will be. He looked at her then, direct and unguarded in a way he had not been before. You want to know why, don't you? Why now, after all these years? I can see it in your face every time you look at me. Cora considered denying it, then found she had not the energy for the pretense. Yes, she admitted, I want to know why. Albert Garrett was quiet a long moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. There was a girl, he said finally. Her name was Sarah Whitfield. I met her in a town in Colorado, years after I'd left Dutch's outfit and gone to ranching under a different name, trying to leave the whole business behind me, the way a man tries to leave a fever behind by riding hard enough. She didn't know what I'd been. I never told her, coward that I was. We were to be married that autumn. He paused, and his voice, when he continued, had gone rough. She took sick with the same fever that killed half that town that year, and I sat with her 3 days and 3 nights, and on the last night near the end, she told me she was afraid God wouldn't have her, on account of some small unkindness she'd done a neighbor woman years before and never made right. A small thing, Miss Bancroft. A borrowed dress returned late, a harsh word spoken in anger. Nothing at all next to what I had done. And it near broke her heart all the same to think she might die without setting it right. He stopped, and Cora saw with something like shock that his eyes had gone wet. She died before dawn, he said. And I sat there afterward and I thought of all the harm I'd done, all the men I'd helped rob and terrify and in your father's case kill outright, and I thought, if a small unkindness could weigh so heavy on so gentle a soul as hers, what in God's name is going to become of mine? I rode out of that town 3 days after we buried her, and I have not stopped building since. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me, Miss Bancroft. I tell you because you asked me why, and that is the truest answer I have. Cora stood very still in the long shadow of the half-built schoolhouse, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that there were tears standing in her own eyes as well. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and meant it, though a moment before she would have sworn she had no sympathy left in her for this man at all. I don't deserve your sorrow any more than I deserve your father's forgiveness, Albert Garrett said, but I thank you for it all the same. They stood together a while longer in the gathering dusk, saying nothing more, and when Cora finally turned to walk home, she found her steps slower than usual, and her thoughts, for the first time in 20 years, no longer entirely occupied by grief for her father, but by something new and unwelcome and altogether harder to name. The schoolhouse rose through the summer months, and slowly, grudgingly, the town's hostility began to soften into something more like wary tolerance. Part of this was owed to small kindnesses Albert Garrett performed without any apparent calculation of how they might be received. He mended the widow Calloway's fence without being asked, after a spring storm knocked it flat. He sat up 2 nights running with a sick mule belonging to a farmer named Otis Prout, a man who had lost his own father to Dutch Malone's gang, and had sworn loudly, in the beginning, that he would shoot Garrett on sight. And when young Tommy Reed, Holly's grandson, took a bad fall from the schoolhouse rafters and broke his wrist, it was Albert Garrett who carried the boy the full mile to the doctor's office at a dead run, refusing to set him down even when his own breath came ragged and his legs shook with the effort. You didn't have to run the whole way, Cora told him afterward, finding him slumped exhausted on the doctor's porch steps while the physician set Tommy's wrist inside. He was scared, Albert said simply. Wagon would have jostled him worse. Man my age ought to still be able to run a mile for a frightened child, or what good is he? He winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. Though I confess I felt every one of my 50 years doing it. Cora sat down beside him on the step, not entirely sure why she did so. You surprised a good many people today, Mr. Garrett, Otis Prout among them. Otis Prout has more reason to hate me than most anyone in this town, Albert said. I don't need his good opinion, only his forgiveness someday if he can find it in him. And mine. The question came out before Cora had quite decided to ask it, and she felt her face warm at her own boldness. Albert turned to look at her, and something in his weathered face softened. Yours most of all, he said quietly, though I never once thought to deserve it. It was Tommy Reed's broken wrist, oddly enough, that did more to shift the town's heart than any sermon or speech could have managed. A man who would run a mile carrying another man's grandson, sparing his own aching body no mercy, was a hard man to keep hating with the same fierce simplicity as before. By the time the schoolhouse walls stood fully raised and the roof beams were being set, several of the town's men had taken to helping in the evenings after their own chores were done, not out of any declared forgiveness, but out of the plain practical sense that a job went faster with more hands, and the sooner the school was built, the sooner their own children might sit warm and dry through a Kansas winter instead of shivering in the drafty church basement. Roy Tate remained unconvinced. He watched from a distance, arms crossed, saying little, but Cora noticed he no longer kept his hand quite so near his revolver whenever Albert Garrett passed him in the street. It was on a warm evening in late July, with the schoolhouse roof newly shingled and the last of the daylight fading gold over the prairie, that Albert Garrett asked Cora Bancroft to walk with him, and she, without quite understanding her own willingness, said yes. They walked along the low ridge east of town, where a person could see for miles in every direction. The grass turned silver green in the dying light, a scattering of cattle grazing far off near the creek. I owe you an apology I haven't given proper yet, Albert said as they walked. Not for your father. There's no apology sufficient for that, and I won't cheapen it by pretending words could serve. But for the trouble I've brought you standing up for me in that street the way you did when half this town would rather have seen me hang. I didn't stand up for you, Cora said. I stood up for the schoolhouse. There's a difference. Is there? Albert asked, and there was a gentleness in his voice that made her chest tighten strangely. Because it seemed to me, that day, that you were the only soul in this whole town willing to look at me and see something other than what I'd been. I've turned that over in my mind a great many nights since, trying to understand why. Cora stopped walking and turned to face him, the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face. I don't know why either, Mr. Garrett. I have asked myself the same question, and I confess I don't have a good answer. Perhaps I only wanted to see if a man could truly change after everything. Perhaps I needed to believe it were possible for my own sake, more than for yours. And do you believe it now? She studied his face a long moment, the deep lines carved by years of guilt and grief and hard weather, the eyes that no longer held the fear she'd first seen in the street outside the sheriff's office, but something steadier, something almost like hope. I'm beginning to, she admitted, and the words felt like a door opening somewhere deep inside her chest that she had kept shut for 20 years. Albert Garrett reached out, slow and careful, as though approaching something wild that might startle at sudden movement, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with callus, warm despite the cooling evening air. I know I have no right to ask this of you, he said. I know the ledger between us can never be balanced, not if I built 100 schoolhouses and lived 100 years doing it. But I find myself caring for you, Cora Bancroft, more than I have cared for anything in this world since I buried Sarah Whitfield, and I did not think I would ever feel such a thing again, and I did not expect to feel it here, of all places, with you, of all people. I don't ask you to return it. I only thought you ought to know. Cora felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. She did not pull her hand away. I don't know what to call what I feel, she said honestly. It isn't forgiveness, not yet, not fully. It isn't the anger I carried so long either, though. It's something new, Mr. Garrett, and it frightens me a good deal more than the anger ever did. Albert, he said softly. If you call me Albert, I think I could bear the fright a good deal easier. Albert, she repeated, testing the shape of his given name in her mouth for the first time, and found to her own quiet astonishment that she liked the sound of it. They stood together on the ridge as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars came out over the Kansas prairie, hands clasped, saying nothing more, and something unspoken but unmistakable passed between them in the silence. The schoolhouse was finished by the first week of September, with a proper bell tower and 8 tall windows to let in the light, and 40 desks Albert had ordered freighted in from Kansas City at his own expense, though the town had barely half that many children to fill them yet. The town held a celebration the day the doors first opened, with tables set up in the street bearing pies and roasted meats, and even Roy Tate grudgingly offered Albert Garrett his hand to shake, though he made it plain the debt between them was not fully settled and might never be. "I'll be watching you, Garrett," the sheriff said, gripping his hand hard. "Every day you're in this town." "That's fair, Sheriff," Albert answered. "A man ought to be watched who's done what I've done. I'd think less of you if you weren't." Cora watched this exchange from the schoolhouse steps, a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the late summer heat, and when Albert caught her eye across the crowded street, he smiled, and she found herself smiling back before she had decided to. It was that same evening, as the celebration wound down and lanterns were lit against the gathering dark, that trouble arrived in Wren's Crossing in the form of 3 riders coming in hard from the west, their horses lathered with sweat, and at their head, a lean, hard-faced man Albert Garrett recognized the moment he saw him, recognition draining the color from his face entirely. "Silas Crane," he said under his breath, and Cora, standing near enough to hear, felt a chill run down her spine at the name, remembering the story of the boy nearly shot down in Coyote Bend. Silas Crane reined his horse to a stop in the middle of the celebration, scattering children and overturning a table of pies in the process, and surveyed the scene with a thin, cold smile. "Well, if it ain't Albert Garrett," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sudden hush that had fallen across the street. "Building schoolhouses now, they tell me. Dutch always did say you had a soft streak in you, even back when we rode together. Guess he was righter than he knew. Silas." Albert's voice had gone flat and careful, the voice, Cora realized with a jolt, of a man who had once made his living by controlling exactly such moments as this. "This has nothing to do with you. Get back on your horse and ride on." "Nothing to do with me." Silas Crane laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I hear you've built 7 of these little monuments to your own guilty conscience already, Albert, spending money that ought to have been split 3 ways between you and me, and what was left of Dutch's outfit after the war ground us all down to nothing. That money was ours as much as yours. Seems to me you owe some of us a share of this charitable feeling you've come into, or else an explanation for why you get to buy yourself peace, while the rest of us are still running from bounty hunters and living in root cellars half the year. That money's long spent, Silas, same as it ever was going to be, one way or another. I've got nothing left from those years but what I earned honest after, ranching, and every dollar of it's gone into these schools and none of it's coming to you." "That's so." Silas Crane's eyes drifted past Albert to where Cora stood on the schoolhouse steps, and something in his gaze made her blood run cold. "This the schoolteacher I heard tell of. The one whose daddy you put in the ground back in '67 and now she's sweet on you. That's a fine joke, Albert. Dutch would have laughed himself sick to hear it." "Leave her out of this," Albert said, and there was an edge in his voice now that Cora had not heard from him before, something hard and dangerous that hinted, briefly, at the man he must once have been. "I don't reckon I will," Silas said, and nodded to the 2 riders flanking him. Before anyone in the stunned crowd could react, one of the men had spurred his horse forward and seized Cora by the arm, hauling her half off her feet with a rough, practiced ease that spoke of long habit with exactly this kind of violence. The street erupted into chaos, women screaming, men shouting, children being pulled back by frightened mothers, and Roy Tate's hand went for his revolver, But Silas Crane had his own weapon out and leveled at the sheriff before the man had cleared leather. "Nobody move," Silas called out, "and this schoolteacher don't get hurt. Albert, you ride with us tonight, back to what's left of the outfit, and you sign over whatever money you've got left to finish paying for this fool crusade of yours, or your sweetheart here answers for it. That's the whole of it. Simple as that." Cora, held fast by the rider's grip, forced herself to breathe steady despite the terror clawing at her chest, and looked past her captor to Albert, whose face had gone pale and still as stone. "Albert," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "don't you dare give this man anything on my account." Cora, his voice cracked on her name. "I mean it," she said fiercely. "I have lived 20 years already grieving one loss to men like this. I won't have you throw everything you've built away because of me." Silas Crane laughed again, delighted. "Got some spirit to her, don't she? I can see why you're sweet on her, Albert." He gestured with his revolver toward the darkening street beyond the town. "Make your choice. Time's wasting." Albert Garrett stood very still for a long moment, and Cora watched something shift in his posture, some old, buried instinct rising back to the surface after 20 years of careful burial. When he spoke again, his voice was low and even, and it carried a chill that made even the rider holding Cora hesitate. "You want to know what's changed about me since we rode together, Silas," he said. "I'll tell you plain. Back then, I'd have drawn on you the moment you touched that woman, and let the consequences fall where they would, and likely gotten half this street shot up in the doing of it, same as we did in Coyote Bend when that boy near died for nothing but Dutch's temper. I've spent 8 years now learning there's a better way to answer a threat than with a bullet, if a man's patient enough to find it." He took a slow step forward, hands open and empty at his sides, showing he carried no weapon. "So here is my answer, Silas. You let her go right now, and you and I will talk man to man about what's owed and what ain't. But you do not get to hurt her to get to me. That is the one thing in this whole world I will not permit, and if you test me on it, you will find that the soft-streaked Dutch always teased me about has hard edges to it still, buried down deep, that you would not enjoy meeting." Silas Crane studied him a long moment, some calculation working behind his cold eyes, weighing the certainty in Albert's voice against whatever memory he carried of the man Albert Garrett had once been. Whatever he saw there seemed to give him pause. "Let her go," he said finally, to the rider holding Cora, and the man released her arm. Cora stumbled back, catching herself against the schoolhouse steps, and Otis Prout, of all people, the man who had once sworn to shoot Albert on sight, moved quickly to steady her and pull her back behind the gathered crowd. "Now," Silas Crane said, turning his attention back fully to Albert, "let's talk about what's owed." What followed was not the violence the town had braced itself for, but something Cora would later struggle to describe even to herself. A long, tense negotiation conducted in the open street under lantern light. Roy Tate in half, a dozen armed townsmen standing ready, but holding their fire at Albert's quiet insistence, while Albert Garrett spoke to Silas Crane of debts and guilt, and the particular arithmetic of a conscience trying to settle itself after decades of harm. In the end, it was not money that resolved the standoff, for Albert had truly spent nearly everything he possessed on the 7 schoolhouses already built and the 8th just finished, but a different kind of offer entirely, one that seemed to catch Silas Crane entirely by surprise. "I've got no cash to give you, Silas, that's God's truth," Albert said. "But I've got a deed to 80 acres of grazing land outside of Cheyenne that I never sold, thinking I might settle it myself one day, and I'll sign it over to you free and clear if you ride away from this town tonight, and never trouble Wren's Crossing or any of the towns I've built in again. It's an honest offer of an honest thing, worth more than any of Dutch's old outfit ever had to show for years of running scared. Take it, and go build something with it instead of tearing something down, the way I'm trying to." Silas Crane sat his horse in silence for a long moment, and something in his weathered face, some flicker of exhaustion that mirrored what Cora had seen in Albert's own eyes the day he first rode into town, passed briefly across his features. "80 acres," he said slowly. 80 acres, and my word I'll not trouble you again nor speak your name to any lawman, so long as you keep to your side of it. Another long silence. Then, to the astonishment of the entire gathered town, Silas Crane holstered his revolver and nodded once, sharp and final. "You always did have a strange kind of luck, Albert Garrett," he said. "Might be that soft streak of yours is worth more than Dutch ever gave it credit for. Send the deed to the land office in Cheyenne, care of Silas Crane, and we'll call the whole thing settled." He wheeled his horse around, his two companions following, and the three of them rode off into the darkening prairie without another word, the sound of their hooves fading slowly into silence. The street remained frozen for a long moment after they'd gone, as though the whole town were holding its breath, and then, all at once, the tension broke, and people began speaking all at once, some rushing to check on Cora, others simply sitting down heavily on the boardwalk steps as the fear drained out of them. Albert Garrett crossed the street in 3 long strides and took Cora's face gently in both his weathered hands, searching her eyes with an expression of such raw fear and relief that it took her breath away entirely. "Are you hurt?" he said, his voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "Cora, tell me true, are you hurt anywhere?" "I'm not hurt," she said, and found her own hands trembling as she reached up to cover his. "Albert, you gave away your land, everything you had left. It was never worth as much to me as this town or this schoolhouse or you," he said simply. "I'd have given every acre I ever owned to see you safe tonight, Cora Bancroft, and I'd do it again without a moment's hesitation." Around them, the town was slowly beginning to breathe again, and somewhere in the crowd, Roy Tate holstered his own revolver at last and let out a long, unsteady breath. "I'll say this for you, Garrett," the sheriff called out, his voice rough. "That took more nerve than drawing on him would have. I don't know that I'd have had it in me." "I nearly didn't," Albert admitted, still not taking his eyes from Cora's face. "If he'd have hurt her, Sheriff, I don't know what I'd have done, and I don't much like to imagine it." That night, after the town had finally settled and the lanterns in most windows had gone dark, Cora Bancroft sat on the schoolhouse steps with Albert Garrett beside her, the September night air cool and sweet with the smell of cut grass, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, simply sitting close together in the quiet, still trembling faintly from the evening's fear. "You could have run with him tonight," Cora said finally. "Gone back to whatever life you had before, taken your chances rather than give up that land." "I could have," Albert agreed. "But I found, standing in that street, that there wasn't a single thing in my old life worth more to me than what I've found in this new one. That surprised me some, I'll admit. I didn't know a heart my age could still learn new things, but it seems it can." Cora turned to look at him in the dim starlight, this man who had once terrorized her family and her town, who had spent 8 years and every dollar he owned trying to build something good out of the wreckage of what he'd been, who had just given away the last of his worldly wealth to keep her safe from harm. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am falling in love with you, Albert Garrett, and I do not entirely know what to do with that feeling, given everything that came before it." Albert let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though his eyes were wet in the moonlight. "I have loved you, I think, since the day you stood in that street and told the whole town to let me build before they hanged me. I did not dare hope you might come to feel the same, not after what I took from you. But if you do, Cora, if you truly do, then I would count myself the most fortunate man ever to walk this earth, guilty or not." She leaned toward him then, slowly, giving him every chance to close the distance himself, and when their lips met it was gentle and searching and full of 20 years of grief finally beginning, at last, to loosen its hold on her heart. They were married the following spring, in the schoolhouse Albert had built with his own hands, with Roy Tate himself standing as a witness and Otis Prout, of all people, giving the bride away since her own father could not, an act that moved half the town to tears and settled something old and painful in Cora's heart that she had not known could still be settled. The town's minister, a young man new to Wren's Crossing who had no history with either of them, spoke of forgiveness and redemption in terms that made even the most skeptical of the older townsfolk nod along. And when Albert Garrett slipped a simple gold band onto Cora Bancroft's finger, his hands, for once, did not tremble at all. They settled into the small house at the edge of town that had once belonged to Cora alone, and Albert, no longer needing to travel from town to town seeking redemption in isolation, found instead that he could pursue his mission with a partner beside him. Over the following years, they traveled together each summer once the school term ended, to the remaining towns Dutch Malone's gang had once terrorized, and Albert Garrett, now with money earned from a small but successful cattle operation he and Cora built together on land near Wren's Crossing, finished the work he had begun. A ninth schoolhouse in a town called Millhaven, a 10th in Sundown Flats, until every town that gang had once ridden through wore a schoolhouse where children learned their letters instead of cowering behind shuttered windows during a robbery. Cora taught in the Wren's Crossing School for many more years, and it was there, in the autumn of 1888, that she gave birth to their first child, a son they named Ezra after her father, a decision that brought Albert to tears the moment she suggested it. "Are you certain," he asked her, holding the infant awkwardly in his big, weathered hands, "that you want his name carried by a child of mine?" "I want it carried by our child," Cora said firmly, "because I think my father would understand, better than most, what it means for a man to spend his final years trying to build something good out of the wreckage of what came before. He was a forgiving man, Albert. I remember that about him more than I remember his death, now, after all this time, and I think he would have wanted his name to mean hope for us, not only grief." 2 years later came their daughter, whom they named Sarah, after the woman whose death had first set Albert on his long road of penance. And Cora, far from feeling any jealousy at the name, understood it as a kind of gratitude, a recognition that Sarah Whitfield's brief, gentle life and painful death had been the spark that eventually led Albert Garrett to a street in Wren's Crossing, and to her. Roy Tate, in time, became one of Albert's closest friends, the old wariness between them softening year by year into a wry, teasing camaraderie that surprised everyone who remembered the tension of that first day in the dusty street. Otis Pruitt's own children were among the first to fill the desks of the Wren's Crossing schoolhouse, and it was Otis himself, some years later, who successfully petitioned the county to rename the school in honor of both Albert and Cora Garrett, an honor Albert accepted only with great reluctance and much persuasion from his wife. "I don't want my name on a building meant for children," he told her, the night the county clerk's letter arrived. "It ought to be a place free of my history, not marked by it." "Then think of it this way," Cora said, setting the letter aside and taking his weathered hands in hers, the way she had 100 times before over the years. "Let it be a place marked not by what you did, Albert Garrett, but by what you became. Let the children who study there grow up knowing that a man can spend his youth doing great harm and still spend his final years undoing it, patiently, humbly, one board and one nail at a time. That is not a shameful thing to teach a child. It may be the most hopeful thing there is." Albert was quiet a long moment, looking at her in the lamplight of their small, warm kitchen, their son Ezra asleep in the next room, and their daughter Sarah not yet born, but already announced by the gentle roundness of Cora's belly. "You have a way of turning my worst self into something bearable," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not know how I earned you, Cora, but I thank God every single day that I did." "You did not earn me," Cora said, smiling despite the tears standing in her own eyes. "None of us earn the people we love, Albert. We only choose them again and again, every single day we wake up beside them and choose to keep loving them despite everything that came before. That is all any marriage is in the end, a choice, renewed daily." By the time Albert Garrett reached his 72nd year, he and Cora had built 11 schoolhouses across the towns of Kansas and the nations that Dutch Malone's gang had once terrorized, and their own family had grown to include Ezra, Sarah, and a younger son named Daniel, born when Cora was 46 and considered by the town doctor something of a small miracle. Grandchildren followed in their turn, filling the Garrett household with a noise and warmth that Albert, in his old outlaw years, could never have imagined for himself. And on quiet evenings, he would often sit on the porch of the house he and Cora had built together, watching his grandchildren play in the yard, and think of the boy in Coyote Bend who had nearly died for nothing, and the schoolhouse that now stood in that same street, and feel something settle in his chest that he could only describe to himself as peace. Cora Bancroft Garrett lived to see her husband grow old and gray and gentle in ways she could never have predicted on that first dusty afternoon when his wagon rolled into Wren's Crossing, loaded with lumber and guilt in equal measure. She watched him teach his own grandchildren to true a joint and set a window frame square, the same skills he had once used to build 11 monuments to his own long redemption. And she watched the fear and suspicion that had once greeted his name in a dozen towns soften, over the decades, into something closer to gratitude and, in time, to genuine affection. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Wren's Crossing gathered at the schoolhouse that bore both their names, and Roy Tate, now retired from the sheriff's office and gray-bearded himself, stood before the assembled crowd and told the story of the day Albert Garrett had ridden into town with a wagon of lumber and an offer nobody believed, and how a schoolteacher named Cora Bancroft had been the only soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to give him the chance he did not deserve. "I have known this man near 35 years now," Roy Tate said, his voice rough with age and feeling, "and I will tell you plainly, I did not think that first day that Albert Garrett had one single decent bone left in his body. I was wrong, and I am glad every day of my life since that Cora Bancroft was wiser than I was and braver, and saw something in him that the rest of us could not." Albert Garrett, sitting beside his wife with their grandchildren gathered around them, reached over and took Cora's weathered hand in his, the same gesture he had made on a quiet ridge overlooking the prairie some 30 years before, and found that her hand fit in his still, exactly as it always had. "I spent the first half of my life taking from towns that never did me any harm," he said quietly, when Roy Tate had finished and the crowd had turned to him, expecting some word from the man himself. "I spent the second half trying to give some small part of it back, and I could not have done a single day of that work without the woman sitting beside me now, who looked at a guilty man in a dusty street and chose, against every reason the world gave her, to believe he might yet become something better. I do not know what I did in this life to deserve such mercy, Cora. I only know that I have tried every day since to be worthy of it, and I mean to keep trying every day I have left." Cora Bancroft Garrett looked at her husband, this man who had once terrorized the very town now gathered to honor him, who had spent his final years, and would spend all the years left to him, building instead of destroying, giving instead of taking, and she felt her heart fill with a love so complete and so hard-won that it brought tears to her eyes even after 30 years of marriage. "You were always worthy of it, Albert," she said softly, for his ears alone amid the noise of the celebrating crowd. "You simply needed someone brave enough to tell you so, until you could believe it yourself." And there, in the schoolhouse they had built together out of guilt and grace, and 20 years of grief finally transformed into something gentler, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would never know the terror their grandfather's name had once carried, Albert Garrett and Cora Bancroft Garrett held each other close, two people who had found, against every possible expectation, that love could grow even in soil once scorched by violence, if only someone was patient enough, and brave enough, and forgiving enough to tend it. They lived on together many years more, watching their schools fill with generations of children who knew Albert Garrett only as the gentle old rancher who had once, long ago, done something wrong and spent the rest of his days making it right. And Cora, as the schoolteacher who had taught half the county its letters and never once, in all those years, regretted the choice she had made in a dusty street on a spring morning in 1886, when she looked at a guilty man's trembling hands and chose, against all reason, to believe that redemption was possible after all. And so it was that in the towns once terrorized by Dutch Malone's outfit, the schoolhouses still stood long after both Albert and Cora Garrett had grown old together, their names spoken not with fear but with a quiet, abiding gratitude, a testament to the truth that even the hardest of hearts, given time and patience, and the steady, unwavering love of one brave woman, could be remade into something worth remembering with tenderness instead of terror. And that the story of the outlaw and the schoolteacher who found love amid the wreckage of an old and violent grief would be told in Wren's Crossing, and in Coyote Bend, and in Millhaven and Sundown Flats and every other town where a schoolhouse bell still rang each morning, for as long as children gathered to learn their letters beneath its roof, for generations yet to come.